One of the most profitable literary empires in history, generating millions of dollars every single year, was built on a dark genetic debt. For 5 generations, the Hemingway family paid this debt with their own lives. They had everything the world could offer: global fame, million-dollar contracts, and the adoration of millions of fans. But all of this wealth was merely a cash advance on an inevitable tragedy. To understand the Ernest Hemingway biography and the dark reality of the Hemingway family history, we must look past the glamorous myth. The Hemingway curse was not a poetic tragedy of creative minds. It was a biological liquidation. This is the grim reality behind the Hemingway family suicides. A cycle of self-destruction that claimed everyone from the legendary writer himself to his famous granddaughter, Margaux Hemingway. The true catalyst of this family collapse was not a creative crisis or the pressure of fame. The answer was locked away in a secret medical file from 1961, buried deep inside the archives of the Mayo Clinic. This single document proved that the family genius was biologically doomed from the very start. We will reveal the shocking contents of this medical file in Chapter 5. This is the cold, financial history of a brilliant dynasty built on a biological curse. Every financial empire begins with a ruthless founder. But in this family, the foundation was not built by a venture capitalist or a Gilded Age industrialist. It was built by a doctor. Clarence Hemingway, the father of the great writer, was a man obsessed with absolute control and ruthless discipline. He ran his household like a military camp. Every cent was tracked, every action was judged. But extreme control cannot save a man from the cold laws of the market. In 1928, Clarence lost his entire life savings in a disastrous Florida real estate speculation. The financial ruin completely destroyed his ego. In his quiet bedroom, he made the decision to terminate his own life. His son, Ernest, never forgave his mother for her reaction to the tragedy. She sent him the very pistol his father used as a cold Christmas present. It was a brutal gesture that sealed the family fate. But instead of running from this generational darkness, Ernest did something unexpected. He turned it into a highly profitable business. He was about to build a monopoly on pain. Ernest Hemingway did not run from his father's dark legacy. He did something far more ruthless. He monetized it. He built a global monopoly on raw, unfiltered masculinity. He was not just selling novels. He was selling a high-octane lifestyle to an audience desperate for escape. Publishers desperately wanted a piece of his rugged brand. By 1936, his rate was $1 per word. In today's currency, that was an astronomical sum for a single written word. Every sentence was a high-yield financial transaction. He held his publisher, Charles Scribner's Sons, in a financial chokehold. He demanded absolute control over his royalties and marketing. He turned his very existence into a registered trademark. Deep-sea fishing in Cuba, big game hunting in the Serengeti, bloody battlefields in Europe, heavy drinking in Parisian bars. Everything was meticulously packaged, branded, and sold to the highest bidder. He was the ultimate influencer of the 20th century. His personal life was managed like a venture capital fund. He viewed women not as partners, but as strategic acquisitions. 4 marriages, 4 calculated mergers. Each consecutive wife brought more capital, more social connections, and more media leverage than the last. When a wife's marketing value depreciated, he liquidated the asset. He divorced them without a shred of remorse. He replaced them with newer, more profitable models. He was a master of public relations long before the concept of personal branding existed. He dictated what men wore, what they drank, and how they lived. But this aggressive expansion had a hidden cost. The balance sheet of his mind was heavily leveraged. As his bank accounts swelled with cash, the interest rate on his genetic inheritance was quietly compounding. Every bottle of whiskey was a short-term loan against his sanity. Every physical triumph was a distraction from the biological debt collector waiting in the shadows. He believed he could outrun his bloodline with sheer wealth and global fame. He was wrong. The market of human genetics does not accept bailouts. And the ultimate margin call was already being prepared. While Ernest was trading his trauma for luxury, the family line was quietly fracturing under the weight of its own success. At the absolute peak of his global influence, Ernest Hemingway did not just live, he ruled. He was a literary monarch with a sovereign wealth fund built entirely on his own myth. His primary fortress was Finca Vigía. This was a sprawling, luxurious estate in Cuba that cost a massive fortune to maintain. It was a private kingdom. He staffed it like a royal palace. There were dozens of servants, a private tennis court, and a massive swimming pool. He filled the grounds with dozens of stray cats, creating his own eccentric dynasty. He spent thousands of dollars on deep-sea fishing expeditions aboard his customized yacht, the Pilar. He financed lavish, blood-soaked safaris in East Africa, hunting big game while writing off the expenses as research. He bought whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. He was spending cash faster than his publishers could print his books, yet the money kept flowing. In 1954, the Swedish Academy awarded him the Nobel Prize in Literature. The prize came with a cash payout of $26,000. It was an astronomical sum for the era. Ernest made a highly publicized, theatrical gesture. He donated a physical gold medal to the sanctuary of the charity of El Cobre in Cuba. It was brilliant public relations. The crowd cheered his humility. But behind closed doors, he quietly pocketed every single cent of the prize money to fund his expensive lifestyle. He had pioneered a new financial asset class, the literary influencer. Long before social media, corporate brands realized his raw masculinity was pure gold. Gun manufacturers paid him to hold their rifles in photographs. Alcohol conglomerates paid him to drink their spirits in public. His daily life was a highly profitable, carefully curated billboard. He was a one-man conglomerate. His brand value was completely detached from traditional market volatility. He was insulated from inflation. He was protected from economic downturns. His life was a flawless, self-sustaining business model. He had conquered the global market of human attention. He had converted his personal trauma into cold, hard currency. He believed he was completely untouchable. But the balance sheet of the human mind does not care about celebrity status or net worth. The debt was coming due, and the federal government was already watching his every move. By the late 1950s, the grand enterprise of Ernest Hemingway was rotting from within. The human machinery could no longer sustain the weight of the brand. For decades, he had lived as an untouchable titan.
He was a literary monopoly, a global influencer, a man who traded on absolute strength. But the balance sheet of his mind was heavily overdrawn. The first cracks appeared in his sanity. Hemingway became obsessed with the tax collector and the state. He claimed that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was monitoring his bank accounts. He insisted his phones were tapped. He believed agents were tracking his movements in the streets.
His friends shook their heads. His fourth wife, Mary Welsh, dismissed it as alcohol-induced madness. They called it clinical paranoia. But the paranoid man was right. Decades later, declassified files proved that J. Edgar Hoover had indeed placed the author under active surveillance. The government was actively watching his millions. But the real collapse happened behind closed doors. In November 1960, the literary king was secretly checked into the Mayo Clinic under a false name. The diagnosis was severe depression. The treatment was brutal. Doctors administered electroconvulsive therapy. High-voltage electrical currents were sent directly through his brain. 15 sessions in total. The therapy did not heal him. It destroyed his neurological infrastructure. For a writer, memory is the ultimate intangible asset. It is the raw material, the inventory, the working capital. The electroshocks wiped his ledger completely clean. Hemingway could no longer recall the names of his friends. He could no longer remember the details of his own adventures. He could not even write a simple sentence on a typewriter. His primary asset was liquidated. The factory was dark, and the intellectual property was frozen. The family watched this rapid decline with growing dread. The ultimate cash cow of the 20th century had been reduced to a fragile, silent old man. They believed this was merely a temporary market correction. They did not understand that this was the beginning of a total generational liquidation. The final hour of the Titan was approaching rapidly. On a quiet morning in Idaho, the debt would finally be called due. And the true reason for this horrific downfall was hidden in a secret medical file that the family tried to bury forever. July 2, 1961, Ketchum, Idaho. The final audit of Ernest Hemingway was completed in the quiet of his own foyer. The man who spent a lifetime selling the illusion of absolute control made his final, irreversible transaction. But this was not a sudden bankruptcy of the mind. It was a pre-programmed liquidation. Now we must look at the secret medical file from the Mayo Clinic, the one we locked away in our prologue. This was the document that proved the entire empire was built on biological quicksand. It was not simple depression. It was not the pressure of the blank page. The diagnosis was hemochromatosis. This is a rare, devastating genetic defect. The human body loses its ability to metabolize iron. Instead of processing the metal, the system stores it. Iron floods the vital organs. It poisons the liver. It slowly calcifies the brain, destroying tissue and sabotaging cognitive function. It triggers severe, terrifying psychoses. The mind becomes a toxic prison of its own biological making. It was a physical debt written directly into the Hemingway DNA, a high-interest loan inherited at birth. There was no bankruptcy court for this disease. There was no way to restructure the debt. The biological tax collector came for the entire family tree, demanding payment in full. His sister Ursula closed her ledger in 1966.
His brother Lester followed the exact same dark path in 1982. Then came the third generation. The brand was too powerful to die, so it recruited fresh blood to keep the cash flowing. Margaux Hemingway, the legendary granddaughter, became the new face of the family asset. She was stunning. She was magnetic. In 1975, she signed a historic perfume contract with Fabergé for $1 million. It was the largest contract in the history of the fashion industry at that time. She was paid to embody luxury, to smile for the cameras, to pretend the family curse had been spent. But wealth is a poor shield against genetic destiny.
In 1996, exactly 35 years to the day after her grandfather, Margaux paid the exact same biological toll. The Hemingway name remained a highly valuable corporate asset, but the family vault was running entirely out of living heirs. The brand was surviving, but its creators were being systematically erased. And yet, the corporate machine was just getting started. What happens to an empire when the bloodline runs cold? It becomes a corporate balance sheet. The tragedy of the Hemingway family did not end with the physical demise of its members. It was repackaged. It was monetized. The surviving heirs faced a brutal choice. They could carry the heavy burden of their genetic inheritance in silence, or they could sell it to the highest bidder. They chose the market. The intellectual property became infinitely more valuable than the living heirs. Ernest's sons began the systematic commercialization of their father's ghost. But the curse did not stop collecting its interest. His youngest son, Gregory, lived a life fractured by immense psychological pain. He battled severe gender dysphoria, transitioning to Gloria. The end was not glamorous. In 2001, Gloria died in a cold, concrete cell in a Miami detention center. Another life claimed, another payment made to the biological debt. With the family members fading, the corporate machine took complete control. Today, the literary titan's legacy is managed by Hemingway Limited. It is a cold, calculating licensing empire. They do not sell literature. They sell lifestyle. Every signature on a licensing agreement is a transaction of blood for capital. The Hemingway brand now licenses high-end safari clothing. They sell luxury rum. They sell expensive hunting rifles. They even sell a signature line of mahogany furniture designed to evoke the warmth of a Havana estate. The dark, agonizing despair of 5 generations has been sanitized. It has been polished. The trauma of Ketchum and the tragedy of the fashion runways are converted into quarterly dividends. It is now presented in glossy catalogs for wealthy consumers who want to buy a piece of artificial masculinity. The madness of a genius is now a lifestyle aesthetic. Death, it turns out, is the most profitable commodity of all. Wealth can build walls. It can buy private clinics. It can hire the best lawyers. But wealth is entirely useless against the relentless code of human biology. The greatest dynasties spend millions trying to purchase immortality. They forget a simple, brutal law of the universe. Nature never accepts credit. It always demands its debts be paid in cash. If you want to uncover the dark financial truths behind the world's most powerful families, subscribe to the channel now.